This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. It does not depict real people, actual events, or official military actions. May 2023 was supposed to be quiet for me. That was the plan. Show up, sit where I was told, smile when required, and leave without being remembered. At 38, I had learned how to move through family events like a ghost, polite, invisible, and efficient. The Cincinnati Country Club was everything my stepfather loved: polished wood crystal glasses, low laughter that never quite reached the eyes. The kind of place where reputations mattered more than truth. I wore a simple navy dress, long sleeves, even though the room was warm because habits are hard to break. My left wrist was covered out of instinct, not shame. I had learned long ago that if people did not see the scar, they would not ask questions, and if they did not ask questions, they could not judge answers they did not deserve. Richard Hale. My stepfather was already holding court near the bar when I arrived. 62 years old, loud, confident, and practiced at making himself the center of any room. He had raised my stepsister as if she were glass, and me as if I were a rough edge to be sanded down in public. That day, he was in rare form, shaking hands, laughing too hard, clapping people on the back as if the wedding belonged to him. When he saw me, he smiled the way someone does when they think they are about to be generous. "Sarah," he said, loudly waving me over, "I want you to meet the groom's family." I knew better than to hesitate. Hesitation always gave him time. We walked together toward a small circle of well-dressed strangers, the groom's parents, an uncle, maybe a cousin, all smiling politely, all waiting to be impressed. Richard placed his hand on my shoulder a little too firmly and said, "This is my stepdaughter, Sarah." He paused just long enough for the silence to stretch. Then his eyes dropped to my wrist. He reached for my sleeve and pulled it back before I could react. There it was, pale against my skin, a thin, uneven line running along my wrist, catching the chandelier light. "That scar," he said, chuckling. "That's what happens when you're careless." The words landed clean and sharp. Not cruel enough to sound deliberate, not soft enough to be forgiven. Laughter followed, not everyone, but enough. The kind of laughter people use to prove they belong. I felt my face heat and my chest tighten, but I did not move. I did not speak. Years of training had taught me that reaction was a luxury. My mother-in-law to be looked confused, then uncomfortable. My stepsister shifted closer to Richard as if instinctively protecting him. My mother stood a few feet away, staring at her champagne glass. No one corrected him. No one asked what the scar meant. They did not need to. The story had already been written for them. Careless, clumsy, a problem child who never quite grew up. I stood there while Richard kept talking, making a small joke about how I had always been accident-prone, how some people just never learned. Each sentence drew another polite laugh, another nod, another confirmation that this version of me was easier to accept. I could have spoken. I could have explained. I could have told them where that scar came from and what it cost and who did not come home. Instead, I did nothing. I let the silence do its work. That was the moment I understood something clearly. This was not just about me. It was about power, about who was allowed to define the story and who was expected to carry it quietly. If you have ever stood in a room where someone you trusted turned you into a punchline in front of witnesses, then you already know what it feels like when the floor does not move, but something inside you does. If you have ever been humiliated in public, stay with me. For a moment after Richard finished speaking, I did not feel anything at all, and that frightened me more than anger ever could. It was as if my body had chosen to shut everything down at once. Sound, touch, temperature, all muted under a thick, invisible layer. I stood there with a polite expression fixed on my face, while the small circle around us loosened and shifted, people turning slightly away the way they do when discomfort threatens to linger too long. I caught fragments of sound laughter thinning into coughs, a chair scraping softly against the floor, the clink of glass on glass. No one met my eyes. Not because they were cruel, but because they were relieved it was not them. That realization settled heavily in my chest. Public humiliation is rarely loud for long. It arrives sharp and then dissolves into manners. I nodded once as if the conversation had ended naturally and stepped back from the group. My legs moved before my mind caught up guiding me away from the bar, past tables dressed in white linen, past centerpieces arranged with expensive restraint. I remember thinking absurdly that the flowers were real, not silk, which meant someone had paid extra for something that would wilt by morning. The thought anchored me just enough to keep walking. At the edge of the room, near a narrow hallway marked restrooms, I paused and breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, the way I had been taught years earlier when panic threatened to take control. In for 4 hold, for 4, out for 4. I waited until my hands stopped trembling. Inside the restroom, the lighting was softer, the mirrors edged with gold frames slightly smudged despite the elegance of the place. 2 women stood near the sinks murmuring to each other. They fell silent when they saw me and offered thin smiles that did not reach their eyes. I returned the courtesy and stepped into an empty stall, locking the door behind me. The quiet pressed in, and with it the weight of what had just happened. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal divider and let my eyes close. I did not cry. That surprised me. There had been a time when a comment like that would have sent me spiraling into shame and apology. Now there was only a dull pressure behind my ribs, and a distant echo of something like disbelief. When I stepped back out, I went to the sink and washed my hands slowly, watching the water run clear over my skin. I rolled my sleeve up deliberately and studied the scar in the mirror. It looked the same, as it always had a pale, uneven line, no longer angry, no longer fresh, just present. Under the lights, it almost blended in unless you knew to look for it. I turned my wrist slightly, watching how the skin pulled and released. For a brief moment, the memory surfaced not as images but as sensation, heat, concussion. The metallic taste that filled my mouth afterward, the absolute certainty that I was still alive when others were not. I swallowed and let the memory pass. This was not the place for it. I dried my hands, smoothed my sleeve back down, and straightened my posture. When I left the restroom, I did not hurry. Rushing would have been a kind of surrender. I returned to my table where my assigned seat waited untouched. The people around me resumed their conversations with exaggerated enthusiasm, talking about the weather, the music, the cake flavors, as if nothing had happened. One woman commented on the band choice, another leaned over to ask if I had traveled far. I answered politely, keeping my voice even, my words light. Administrative work, I said, when asked what I did for a living. Planning, coordination. It was not a lie. It was simply incomplete. Across the room, I could see Richard laughing again, already moving on to the next audience, the next story. He did not look at me. That was intentional. Acknowledging my silence would have required him to consider it. I watched my stepsister beside him nodding, smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She did not look at me either. I wondered briefly if she felt relieved or embarrassed or simply accustomed to this dynamic. The question passed without needing an answer. The band began to play softly, signaling a transition, and servers moved between tables with practiced grace. I accepted a glass of water and held it steady despite the tightness in my throat. The urge to explain rose once, then fell away. Explanation implies permission. I had spent too many years offering context in the hope of earning basic decency. I was done with that. Instead, I focused on control, on staying present, on not allowing this moment to dictate the rest of the evening. Shock has a way of narrowing time, stretching seconds into something viscous and heavy. I felt that stretch now, but I also felt something else underneath it, a familiar steadiness that had carried me through far worse than an offhand comment in a polished room. I did not know then how the night would end. I did not know who would speak or what would be revealed. All I knew was that I would not be the one to break first. I sat there among the quiet clatter of silverware and polite conversation, letting the moment settle, letting the room believe whatever story it needed to believe, for now. Silence can be a shield if you know how to hold it. I held mine, carefully waiting. Tell me in the comments if you would have spoken up or stayed silent. To understand why I did not react that night, you have to go back almost 20 years to a different house, a different silence, and a different version of me. In 2005, my father died suddenly of a heart attack on a cold October morning in Dayton, Ohio. I was 20 and away at community college when the call came. By the time I got home, the house already felt rearranged, as if grief had picked things up and put them back slightly wrong. My mother moved through those weeks in a careful haze, doing what needed to be done. Signing papers, thanking neighbors, answering casseroles with nods instead of words. I learned then that loss does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just removes the center and waits to see what collapses next. Richard Hale entered our lives less than a year later. He was confident, employed, well-spoken, and very clear about how things should be done. He had a daughter from a previous marriage younger than me, prettier than me, and already fluent in the language of approval. Where my mother was quiet, Richard was decisive. Where my father had been gentle, Richard believed in correction. He spoke often about structure, about standards, about how families fell apart when people were not kept in line. At first, I tried to believe he meant well. He fixed things around the house, organized the garage, balanced the checkbook, and complimented my mother loudly in front of others. People said she was lucky. I heard that word a lot. Lucky to have found someone strong. Lucky not to be alone. Lucky to have help. What people did not see was how quickly help became authority. Richard moved into the house and into the role of final word without asking. He decided which pictures stayed on the walls, which routines mattered, which opinions were worth hearing. His daughter followed easily, adapting to the rules with a kind of graceful compliance that earned her praise. She was easy, he would say, smiling at her across the dinner table. She listens. She tries. You should be more like her. It did not sound like an insult at first, just advice. But over time, the comparison sharpened. If she was careful, I was careless. If she was disciplined, I was stubborn. If she was charming, I was awkward. Every difference between us became evidence of a flaw in me rather than a fact of personality. Richard rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. Control does not require volume when repetition does the job. He commented on my body early and often always framed as concern. You would look so much better if you lost a little weight. Are you sure you need seconds? That shirt is not flattering. His daughter could eat whatever she wanted and be called lucky. I was told to be mindful. At family gatherings, he introduced her with pride, listing her achievements, her activities, her plans. When it was my turn, he summarized, "This is Sarah. She is still figuring things out." Laughter followed, sometimes light, sometimes uncomfortable. My mother did not intervene. I do not think she knew how. After my father died, she clung to peace wherever she could find it, and Richard offered peace with conditions. If we did not challenge him, the house stayed calm. If we did, the temperature dropped. I learned to read those shifts quickly, to anticipate when to speak and when to stay quiet. I was labeled difficult not because I fought him, but because I did not mirror him. I asked questions. I resisted being reshaped. That resistance made me the problem child. In 2007, when I told them I was considering the military, Richard laughed openly. "You," he said, looking me up and down. "You would never make it. Too soft, too slow, too emotional." His daughter chimed in without malice, just repeating what she had learned. "It does not really fit you," she said kindly. I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise, but I said nothing. Silence had become a habit by then, a way of surviving without surrendering completely. Over the next few years, the comments continued, small enough to deny, but consistent enough to leave marks. Richard had a talent for saying just enough to undermine without appearing cruel. He praised my stepsister for being presentable while reminding me that appearance mattered. He joked about my clumsiness when I tripped over a step and retold the story at Thanksgiving as if it were a family legend. People laughed because he laughed. That was the pattern. Humor as cover. Comparison as discipline. Approval as currency. I began to shrink myself not physically but socially. I stopped volunteering opinions, stopped bringing friends home, stopped expecting fairness. When something went wrong, Richard looked at me first. When something went right, he congratulated his daughter for setting a good example. It was never overt enough to confront and always persistent enough to exhaust. Psychological control works best when it convinces you that the problem is your reaction, not the behavior that provoked it. By 2010, the roles were fixed. My stepsister was the golden child, adaptable, admired, protected. I was the liability tolerated but never trusted. When relatives visited, Richard would recount stories that cast him as the patient guide and me as the stubborn project. I listened from the other room, pretending not to hear. I learned that invisibility was safer than defense, that being overlooked hurt less than being reduced. When I finally left for training later that year, Richard shook my hand firmly and said, "Try not to embarrass us." It sounded like a joke. It was not. That sentence followed me longer than he ever did. It echoed during long runs, early mornings, and quiet nights when doubt crept in. But it also clarified something. I did not owe him proof. I did not owe him success performed for his approval. The military did not care about my role in his story. It asked different questions. Could I show up? Could I learn? Could I lead without needing applause? That contrast saved me. Favoritism had taught me what not to seek. Control had taught me the value of boundaries even when I did not yet know how to draw them. By the time we arrived at that wedding in 2023, the pattern was old, familiar, and unchallenged. Richard spoke. Others laughed. I stayed quiet. To anyone watching, it probably looked like compliance. It was not. It was preparation. I enlisted in the Army in the spring of 2007 without ceremony or announcement. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed doors, no speeches about destiny. I filled out the paperwork at a small recruiting office near downtown Dayton after class one afternoon and walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in years. It was not courage that pushed me forward. It was clarity. I understood for the first time that leaving was not abandonment. It was self-preservation. When I shipped to basic training at Fort Jackson later that summer, I told my mother I would call when I could and told Richard nothing at all. He found out through someone else and left a voicemail that said good luck, as if the words themselves were an obligation he had nearly forgotten. Fort Jackson was hot in a way that felt deliberate, like the air itself was part of the test. The days began before sunrise and ended only when exhaustion made sleep unavoidable. I learned quickly that the Army did not care who you had been at home. There were no shortcuts for charm, no points for being favored. Everyone stood in the same lines, carried the same weight, learned the same rules. That uniformity was a relief. For the first time in my life, expectations were written down. If you met them, you passed. If you did not, you were corrected. Not mocked, not compared. Corrected. Discipline replaced judgment. Structure replaced guesswork. I kept my head down and did exactly what was asked of me. I learned how to make my bunk tight enough to bounce a coin, how to move with purpose, how to listen before speaking. When drill sergeants yelled, it was not personal, it was procedural. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. I stopped waiting for approval and started measuring myself against standards that did not shift with mood. The Army became a language I could understand. Clear commands, clear consequences, clear results. I did not stand out, and I did not try to. I finished where I finished and moved on. When others complained, I stayed quiet. Silence had always been my refuge, but here it was not a sign of weakness. It was simply focus. After basic came advanced training, then my first assignment. Each step built on the last with no need for explanation. No one asked why I was there. They asked whether I could be trusted to do my job. That question felt honest. Over time, something unexpected happened. The constant pressure steadied me. The routines anchored me. The responsibility gave shape to days that once blurred together. I learned to rely on myself in ways I never had before. If I failed, it was my failure to fix. If I succeeded, it was because I had done the work. There was no one to blame and no one to impress. That balance felt like freedom. I did not talk about my family. I did not talk about home. When asked where I was from, I said Ohio and left it there. When asked why I joined, I said I wanted structure. That was true enough. As the years passed, I took on more responsibility quietly. I did my time, learned my trade, and moved when told. I did not call Richard to update him on promotions. I did not send photos home. I learned early that my accomplishments did not need witnesses from the past. They needed accountability in the present. The Army did not offer affection, but it offered fairness. If you showed up prepared, people noticed. If you did not, you were corrected and moved aside. There was no favoritism worth mastering because competence was easier to verify than charm. That suited me. I learned to lead by listening first and speaking last. I learned that authority did not require volume. It required consistency. I watched officers who demanded respect and officers who earned it, and I took notes. I became very good at not drawing attention while still being dependable. That skill followed me everywhere. When others sought praise, I sought clarity. When mistakes happened, I owned mine and fixed them. Over time, that reputation traveled ahead of me. Reliable, steady, uncomplicated. The Army became my substitute family, not because it was warm, but because it was honest. You knew where you stood. You knew what was expected. You knew the cost of failure and the value of effort. No one laughed at your mistakes in public. No one reduced you to a nickname. Corrections were direct and brief, and then you moved on. That mattered more than I can explain. There were nights when the quiet felt heavy, and I wondered what my life would have been if my father had lived, or if Richard had been different. Those thoughts came and went without ceremony. I learned not to linger on questions that could not be answered. Purpose has a way of crowding out regret. By the time I had been in a few years, the Army had reshaped me in ways that were subtle but permanent. I stood differently. I spoke with intention. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. None of that felt like rebellion. It felt like alignment. I did not become harder. I became clearer. When I went home on leave, I noticed the difference immediately. Richard still spoke in absolutes. My stepsister still moved easily through rooms that felt tight to me, but their words no longer carried the same weight. I listened without absorbing. I nodded without conceding. I had found a place where effort mattered more than narrative, and that changed everything. The Army did not fix my past, but it gave me a present that was governed by rules rather than moods. Withdrawal had turned into purpose quietly, steadily, without fanfare. I did not need to announce who I was becoming. I simply became it one day at a time. The scar came in 2012 during my second deployment to Afghanistan, and it arrived the way most permanent things do, without warning and without ceremony. We were operating out of a forward location that did not look like much on a map and felt even smaller in real life, a cluster of low structures surrounded by dust and horizon. By then, I had been in long enough to understand the rhythms of deployment, the way days blurred together, the way routines became anchors, and how silence could mean safety or danger depending on its shape. That morning began like dozens before it. Equipment checks, brief conversation, weather complaints, the small human rituals that happen even when you know the day will test you. We moved as scheduled, no heroics, no drama. Just a convoy following procedures that had been drilled into us until they lived in muscle memory. When the blast happened, it did not look the way movies teach you to expect. There was no fireball, no cinematic pause. It was a concussion, a sudden, violent pressure that collapsed the world inward and then released it all at once. I remember sound first, not the blast itself, but the way everything went dull afterward, as if someone had turned down the volume on reality. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. Training took over hands, moving eyes, scanning breath measured even as my heart raced. I was on the ground, then on my feet again, helped by someone whose face I did not see. The dust settled slowly, coating everything with the same muted color. I checked the people around me the way I had been taught: names, faces, movement. Everyone accounted for. No one lost. That mattered. Only after that did I feel the sting in my wrist where my sleeve had torn. It was not dramatic, just sharp enough to demand attention. Blood marked the fabric, but not much. A medic looked it over, cleaned it, wrapped it, and moved on. We finished the mission. That part is important. We always finished the mission. The scar formed quietly in the weeks that followed a thin line where skin had been broken and repaired imperfectly. It healed unevenly like most real wounds do, refusing symmetry or elegance. At first, it was tender, then it was itchy, then it was simply there. I did not think much about it beyond what it represented privately. It was not a badge, and it was not a burden. It was a record. When I returned stateside and eventually home on leave, my mother noticed it immediately. She asked questions I answered briefly and changed the subject. She wanted more detail, and I did not give it. That was not cruelty. It was containment. Some experiences do not improve when translated. I never mentioned it to Richard. I did not hide it exactly, but I did not explain it either. He saw what he wanted to see, and what he wanted to see never included context that challenged his assumptions. Over the years, the scar faded, but his interpretation of it hardened. To him, it became evidence of carelessness because that fit the version of me he had always maintained. He never asked how it happened. He never asked where. He never asked who else was there. That absence was its own answer. Not knowing requires curiosity. He did not have it. In his world, scars belonged to accidents, not service. They were flaws, not records. He treated them the same way he treated mistakes, things to be pointed out for effect. I learned to cover it not because I was ashamed, but because I was tired. Tired of questions that were not really questions. Tired of explanations that would be dismissed or minimized. Silence was simpler. In uniform, the scar blended in among others' marks that told quiet stories. No one commented unless invited. No one reduced it to a punchline. Out of uniform, it became something else, something open to interpretation by people who had not earned the right to interpret it. I learned which rooms required sleeves and which did not. I learned when to ignore stares and when to redirect conversation. The scar taught me more about people than it did about pain. It revealed who asked and who assumed who listened and who decided before hearing anything at all. By the time of the wedding, it had been more than a decade. The skin had healed. The memory had settled. What remained was the meaning others assigned to it without asking. When Richard pulled back my sleeve that night, he did not see Afghanistan or the people beside me or the moment when everything went quiet and then returned. He saw confirmation. He saw an opportunity. He saw a way to perform superiority using my body as evidence. That was what made it unbearable, not the comment itself, but the casual certainty behind it. The way he felt entitled to explain me to strangers. The way he assumed no one would challenge that explanation. The scar had become a tool in his hands, something to be used rather than understood. Standing there in that polished room, I realized that honor can be distorted when it is removed from its context. A mark that once represented survival and responsibility had been reframed as incompetence because it suited someone else's narrative. That realization hurt more than the original injury. The blast had been impersonal. This was deliberate. I did not correct him because correction would have required me to translate something sacred into language he had already decided to misuse. Some truths do not need defending. They need witnesses. I did not know yet who those witnesses would be. I only knew that the scar was never the problem. The problem was the story told about it by someone who had never earned the right to tell it. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the noise rose to meet me as if nothing had happened, and that was almost worse than if it had stopped. Laughter swelled, music filled the space, and servers moved between tables carrying trays with practiced grace. The room had decided to continue, and I understood that choice because it was easier than reckoning. I walked back to my seat and sat down, smoothing my dress as if the fabric mattered. Across the room, Richard was already holding another group captive, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without sounding rude. I did not look at him again. Instead, I let my eyes travel, taking in details the way I always did when I needed to stay grounded, the way the band leader watched the room before shifting tempo, the way the waitstaff adjusted their paths to avoid collisions, the way certain guests leaned back in their chairs while others stayed alert, leaning forward. That was when I noticed Daniel Foster for the first time, not because he was loud or commanding, but because he was neither. 41, maybe early 40s, clean-cut posture straight, without being rigid. He stood near the head table, speaking quietly with someone older, likely his father. When he laughed, he covered it with his hand, a small habit that suggested restraint, not insecurity. I had seen that posture before in men who had learned how to be present without needing to dominate space. He wore his suit easily as if it were another uniform, and the realization landed without drama. He had served. You do not need rank insignia to recognize bearing. It shows up in how someone scans a room, not nervously but methodically, in how they stand still when others fidget, in how their attention sharpens when something shifts. As Daniel turned his head, his eyes passed over me briefly, then returned a second longer than politeness required. I felt it the way you feel weather change before clouds move. Recognition does not always announce itself. Sometimes it pauses. He excused himself and crossed the room toward the bar. As he passed my table, his gaze dropped briefly to my wrist, then back to my face. There was no judgment in it, only calculation. He did not stop. He did not smile. He simply filed the information away. I took a slow sip of water and let the moment pass. If he had questions, he would wait. People who have worn uniforms understand timing. The reception moved through its stages, appetizers cleared plates, replaced speeches delayed, then resumed. Conversation ebbed and flowed. I answered questions without elaboration. When someone asked how I knew the family, I said I was family and left it there. When someone commented on the elegance of the venue, I agreed. It was easy to be agreeable when you were not invested. Daniel reappeared at the head table and took his place beside my stepsister. She leaned into him, laughing brightly, her hand resting on his arm. He smiled back, but his attention was divided. I could see it now clearly. His eyes tracked movement more than faces. He noticed things others missed. When Richard's laughter cut through the music again, Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at me, then at Richard, then back to his plate. The pieces were aligning quietly. At one point, he stood and moved toward our table, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He offered one to the woman seated beside me, then paused, looking at me directly. "Sarah," he said, pronouncing my name carefully. I nodded. "Daniel, thank you for coming tonight," he said. I smiled politely. "Congratulations." He hesitated, then added, "I hear you traveled in from Kentucky." I did. "Fort Campbell," I said before I could stop myself. The words were out now, neutral and factual. His eyes sharpened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. He nodded once. "Small world," he said. "I served in the Army Reserve for a while, enlisted." I recognized the cadence immediately, the way he offered the information without fanfare, without expectation. "Thank you for your service," I said automatically, then corrected myself. "Or for your time." He smiled faintly. "Same thing sometimes." He glanced at my wrist again, then looked away. We stood there for a beat longer than necessary, then he excused himself, returning to the head table. That exchange lasted less than a minute, but it shifted something in the room for me. For the first time that evening, I felt seen without being exposed. Daniel did not ask questions because he did not need to. He had recognized posture before story, bearing before explanation. He had noticed the way I stood, the way I moved, the way I held silence without shrinking. The scar was just confirmation, not definition. As the evening progressed, the tension tightened subtly, like a wire pulled just enough to hum. Richard continued to perform, unaware that the audience had changed. My stepsister grew animated, telling stories, leaning into Daniel, who listened but did not fully engage. His attention drifted more often now toward me, especially when Richard spoke. He watched reactions rather than words. That told me everything. At one point during a lull before the main toast, the band quieted and the room settled into expectant murmurs. Richard clapped his hands once loudly, drawing attention. Daniel stiffened. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in his posture from guest to something else. Whatever Daniel was about to do had already been decided. He was simply waiting for the right moment. I looked down at my hands resting calmly in my lap and thought about timing, about restraint, about how some truths gain strength when allowed to arrive on their own terms. Respect works the same way. It does not announce itself. It changes the air and waits to be noticed. Have you noticed how respect changes when people realize who you really are? The toast was not scheduled for that moment, which was how I knew something was wrong before Richard even stood. The band had softened into a holding pattern, and the conversations around the room were settling into that anticipatory hush people get when they sense a performance is about to begin. Richard rose with his glass already raised, smiling broadly as if he had been invited. No one stopped him. People rarely stop a man who believes he belongs at the center. He cleared his throat once, then tapped his glass lightly with a fork, the sound thin but effective. Heads turned, chairs angled. The room leaned toward him. I felt my stomach tighten, but my posture stayed the same. I had learned not to flinch at the beginning of a familiar script. Richard launched into praise first, congratulating the couple, complimenting the venue, thanking the families. He knew how to warm an audience. He spoke about tradition, about family, about how proud he was to welcome Daniel into the fold. Daniel listened without smiling, his shoulders squared, his feet planted evenly on the floor. Richard paused just long enough to drink in the attention, then let his gaze travel until it found me. "There it is," he said lightly, gesturing with his glass. "You know Sarah has always been our tough one." The words were framed as affection, but the tone was sharpened by familiarity. He chuckled. "Always getting into things, always collecting little marks along the way." He waved his hand vaguely toward my wrist again, as if the earlier comment had not already landed. I heard a few murmurs, a few restrained laughs. The old pattern tried to reassert itself. My stepsister laughed quickly too loudly, then caught herself. Daniel did not move. Richard continued. "Careless, maybe, but she means well." The room responded the way rooms do when someone presses just far enough to see what they can get away with. A ripple of polite sound moved through the crowd. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger exactly, but something steadier and heavier like a door closing. I did not look at Richard. I looked straight ahead at the band leader who had frozen mid-motion, his hand hovering above the keys. That was when Daniel stood. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. The movement was quiet but decisive, and it cut through the noise more cleanly than any tap of a fork. Richard faltered for half a second, then laughed as if welcoming the addition. Daniel took one step forward and stopped. He adjusted his jacket, then placed his feet together, heels aligned, posture straight, without being rigid. He faced me, not the room. In one smooth, controlled motion, he raised his right hand to his brow. The salute was precise, brief, and unmistakable. Not theatrical, not exaggerated, just correct. The sound left the room as if someone had opened a window and let it escape. I heard the clink of a glass being set down somewhere near the back. I heard someone inhale too quickly. Daniel held the salute for a beat, then lowered his hand and spoke. "Ma'am," he said clearly. The word carried farther than his voice should have allowed. It was not loud, but it was exact. With respect, he continued, she served this country with distinction. The room went still. Richard blinked once, then twice. He looked from Daniel to me and back again, his mouth opening as if to laugh, then closing when no sound came out. Someone near the bar shifted a chair, and the scrape sounded obscene in the silence. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the room now without breaking posture. "Some of you may not know this," he said calmly, "but Sarah McAllister is a United States Army officer. She earned every mark she carries, and she does not owe anyone an explanation for them." The words were not a speech. They were a correction. That distinction mattered. Richard lifted his glass as if to cover the moment with motion and took a hurried sip. The wine did not go down. It sprayed forward, catching the light as it arced and landed across the white tablecloth in a dark, irregular splash. A few drops caught the front of his jacket. He coughed, sputtered, and grabbed for a napkin, his face flushing from more than embarrassment. The sound broke something in the room, and people began to breathe again, but no one laughed. Not this time. My stepsister stared at Daniel, her smile gone, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My mother stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, her eyes fixed on me as if seeing me for the first time. I did not stand. I did not speak. I did not acknowledge the room. I met Daniel's eyes and inclined my head once. He returned the gesture, then stepped back, pulling his chair in quietly and sitting down. The band leader cleared his throat softly and began to play a neutral tune, something without memory. Servers moved instinctively to replace the stained cloth. Conversation tried to resume and failed, then tried again with less confidence. Richard dabbed at his jacket, muttering something about a joke gone wrong, but the words did not land. He had lost the room, and he knew it. Power does not vanish dramatically. It relocates. I felt it move away from him and settle somewhere quieter, steadier. People looked at me now with a different expression, not pity, not curiosity, but recalibration. The story they had accepted minutes earlier no longer fit, and they were adjusting the frame. I remained seated, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my breathing even. Years of discipline held me in place. This was not my moment to perform. It was my moment to allow the truth to stand on its own. Daniel leaned toward my stepsister and whispered something she nodded stiffly. Richard finally looked at me, then really looked at me, and whatever he saw there made him look away. He had assumed silence meant consent. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. The correction had not come from me, and that was why it could not be dismissed. The room would remember this not as an argument, but as a recalibration of reality, A man had spoken out of turn and been answered by facts he could not bend. The chandelier lights seemed harsher now, reflecting off glasses and polished wood, exposing every reaction. I sat there, feeling a calm spread through me, not triumph, not relief, but alignment. This was how justice often arrived, quietly, without spectacle, without cruelty, simply by placing the truth in the center and stepping back. If this moment made your heart stop, tap, like "So I know you are still here." After the moment passed, the room did not snap back into place the way it usually does when embarrassment fades. It reassembled slowly and imperfectly, like a structure being rebuilt with different measurements. I felt it first in the eyes. People looked at me longer now, not in curiosity but in calculation, the way you look at something familiar that has revealed a new dimension. Conversations resumed, but with altered tones. Laughter came softer and stopped sooner. The groom's parents leaned toward each other, whispering not urgently but thoughtfully. His father adjusted his cuff and nodded once, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached. His mother smoothed her napkin and looked at me with a small, restrained smile that held respect rather than sympathy. When she caught my eye, she inclined her head slightly, not as a greeting, but as an acknowledgement. That was new. A few guests approached my table and asked neutral questions about the evening, the music, the venue, anything that allowed them to be near without addressing what had just happened. I answered with the same measured politeness I had used all night. The point was not to capitalize. The point was to remain steady. Across the room, Richard had gone quiet. He sat with his shoulders angled inward, his hands busy with his napkin as if the fabric required study. The confidence that had buoyed him earlier had drained away, replaced by something cautious. He avoided looking in my direction, and when he spoke, it was to the people nearest him in a tone that asked permission rather than assumed attention. No one laughed at his comments now. They nodded politely and returned to their plates. Power had not left him entirely, but it had loosened its grip, and he felt the difference. My stepsister shifted in her seat again and again, unable to settle. She glanced at me, then away, then back again, as if deciding whether to cross a line she had never considered before. When someone congratulated her, she smiled reflexively, but her eyes flicked towards Daniel, who was watching the room rather than the compliments. She leaned close to him, whispering something I could not hear. He responded quietly, his expression calm but firm. Whatever he said did not comfort her. She sat back and folded her hands together, pressing them tightly as if anchoring herself. I noticed small changes everywhere. A cousin who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. A woman from the groom's side asked me if I would like a different drink and waited for my answer as if it mattered. The band played on, but the tempo felt restrained. Servers moved more carefully around our table. Even the lighting seemed harsher, as if the room itself had decided to stop flattering anyone. I did not stand. I did not make a speech. I did not accept congratulations or deflect questions with jokes. I stayed where I was and allowed the shift to finish its work. Silence can be generous if you let it be. It gives people space to rearrange their assumptions without being told they were wrong. That mattered to me. I did not want an apology from the room. I wanted understanding. And understanding was happening quietly in real time. Daniel rose once more, not to speak, but to escort my stepsister to greet an older relative. As they passed my table, he paused for a fraction of a second and met my eyes. There was no triumph there, only confirmation. He had done what he believed was necessary, and now he was done. That restraint told me more about him than any speech could have. The groom's family gathered near the head table, speaking in low voices. I caught fragments of their conversation, not words, but posture heads inclined toward one another, hands open rather than clenched. They were recalibrating too, deciding how this new information fit into their understanding of the evening and of me. I felt no urge to correct or embellish. Facts had already done the work. When Richard finally stood to leave the table, he did so carefully, as if unsure of his footing. He glanced around, perhaps expecting someone to meet his eye and invite him back into the center. No one did. He picked up his jacket and draped it over his arm and walked toward the edge of the room. People stepped aside for him politely, but they did not turn to follow. He passed close enough that I could smell the wine and the faint trace of cologne. He did not speak to me. He did not look at me. The silence between us was heavy, but it was no longer weighted in his favor. It was simply there, a boundary drawn without words. My stepsister watched him go, then looked at me again. Her expression was unreadable. Something between confusion and resentment, and something like loss. She had benefited from the old arrangement, and now it had shifted without her consent. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and looked down. I did not fill the space. Justice does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic exits. Sometimes it comes as a redistribution of attention. Who is listened to? Who is deferred to? Who is assumed credible? That night, those balances changed in small, visible ways. People asked me questions and waited for answers. They listened without interrupting. They did not ask me to perform gratitude or forgiveness. They accepted my presence as sufficient. I felt the weight of years lift incrementally, not because anyone apologized, but because the room had corrected itself. The narrative Richard had carried for so long no longer worked here. It had been challenged publicly and found wanting. That mattered more than any private confrontation could have. As the evening continued, the music picked up and some guests drifted toward the dance floor. Laughter returned cautiously then, with more ease. Life resumed because it always does, but the shape of the room had changed. I could feel it in the way people navigated around me with consideration rather than dismissal. I stayed seated a while longer, watching the movement, letting the quiet satisfaction settle without naming it. I had not sought this moment, and I did not need to extend it. The truth had been spoken by someone with nothing to gain, and that had made all the difference. Justice had arrived not as punishment, but as clarity, and clarity has a way of reorganizing power without asking permission. He approached me later when the room had thinned just enough to offer cover, but not enough to avoid witnesses. I noticed him before he spoke because the air around him had changed. Richard no longer moved like a man who owned the space. His steps were measured, his shoulders slightly rounded as if he were navigating unfamiliar ground. He stopped beside my chair and cleared his throat, once the sound smaller than it had ever been before. "Sarah," he said quietly, not unkindly, but not warm either. I looked up at him and waited. I did not invite him to continue. That was new for both of us. He shifted his weight and glanced around the room as if checking who might be listening, then leaned closer. "I did not mean it the way it sounded," he said. "You know that. It was just a joke. Things got out of hand." His words were careful, chosen to smooth rather than admit. He was trying to contain damage, not understand it. I studied his face, the familiar lines around his mouth, the eyes that had always looked past me rather than at me. For a moment, I considered how easy it would be to nod, to reassure him, to restore the old balance where his comfort mattered more than my dignity. That impulse flickered and passed. I shook my head once slowly. "No," I said, "you meant it exactly the way it sounded." He frowned as if surprised by my certainty. "That is not fair," he replied quickly. "You never tell us anything. How was I supposed to know?" There it was, the pivot, the attempt to relocate responsibility. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I did not offer context. I had learned by then that explanations invite debate, and debate assumes equal standing. We did not have that. "You never asked," I said, "and you never needed to know to be decent." He opened his mouth, then closed it and exhaled sharply through his nose. "People are sensitive these days," he muttered. "Everyone takes offense." I almost smiled at that, the way he reached for a familiar defense, even now. "This is not about sensitivity," I said. "It is about respect." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I was trying to lighten the mood," he said. "You always make things so serious." I felt something settle inside me at that moment, a clarity that was both calm and absolute. "Serious is mocking someone in public," I said. "Serious is deciding who gets dignity and who does not." He finally met my eyes then, and whatever he saw there made him pause. I could tell he was recalculating, searching for a version of me that might bend or soften. He did not find it. "So, what you want an apology?" he asked, his tone edging toward irritation. The question was almost hopeful, as if a single word might erase years of behavior. I shook my head again. "I want you to stop," I said. "Not just tonight. Not just in front of other people. I want you to stop using me as an example. I want you to stop commenting on my body, my choices, my life." He scoffed quietly. "That is just how I am," he said. "I am honest." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, giving myself a moment to choose my words. "Honesty without care is just control," I said, "and I am done participating in that." His eyes flicked toward the dance floor where my stepsister stood laughing a little too brightly with someone from Daniel's family. He followed my gaze and then looked back at me, his expression hardening. "You are overreacting," he said. "This is a wedding. People were drinking. You embarrassed me." That sentence landed clean and revealing. There it was, the center of it. His embarrassment, not my humiliation. I felt no urge to argue. I stood then, not abruptly, but with intention, creating just enough distance to make my next words clear. "I did not embarrass you," I said. "Your behavior did." He stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. "I am not going to debate this with you," I continued. "I am not asking you to understand it tonight or ever. I am telling you what will happen next." He stiffened. "I will not be around you if you speak to me that way," I said. "I will not attend events where you think it is acceptable to mock me. If you cannot treat me with respect, then we will not have contact." He laughed once short and incredulous. "You cannot be serious," he said. "You think you can just cut people off?" I nodded. "I think I already have." His face flushed, then drained. He looked past me again, scanning the room, perhaps expecting someone to intervene to smooth things over. No one did. The moment stretched uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. "Fine," he said, finally, his voice low. "Do what you want." I watched him turn and walk away. His shoulders squared again, not with confidence, but with stubborn pride. He did not apologize. He did not ask questions. He did not acknowledge the boundary I had drawn. That was answer enough. I returned to my seat feeling lighter than I had earlier, not because the conversation had gone well, but because it had gone honestly. Clarity has a way of simplifying things. I knew then that whatever came next, whether silence or escalation or retreat, would not be my responsibility to manage. I had stated the terms. I had reclaimed my voice without raising it. The boundary was set not as a threat, but as a fact. And facts do not require agreement to be real. 3 months passed before I heard from Richard again, and in that time the quiet held. It was not a dramatic silence, just an absence that proved instructive. No calls, no messages, no indirect apologies filtered through my mother. Life returned to its patterns at Fort Campbell, where days were measured by schedules and outcomes rather than moods. I worked late some nights, reviewed plans, mentored a young captain who reminded me of myself years earlier, steady, hungry, careful with her words. The wedding receded into memory, not as a wound, but as a line drawn cleanly. Then, one Tuesday afternoon in late August, my phone buzzed with a number I did not have saved. I let it ring. It buzzed again. I answered on the third call, not out of obligation, but curiosity. "Sarah," he said, and even through the phone I could hear the strain in his voice. I waited. He cleared his throat. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. "I am in town." The old instinct stirred to manage to soothe, to anticipate his needs. I let it pass. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked. A pause. "Things," he said. "Family." I smiled once without humor. "I am at work," I said. "If this is important, you can come by my place tomorrow evening." He agreed too quickly, relief rushing into his yes. The next day, he arrived early, parked crooked in the driveway, and stood on my porch with his hands clasped together as if holding them still might help. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn. I opened the door and stepped aside. He entered and glanced around my living room, noting the order, the absence of clutter, the framed photos placed deliberately rather than decoratively. He did not comment. We sat at the table and I poured water, not coffee. This was not a social call. He began without preamble. "I have had a rough few months," he said. "Some misunderstandings. People talk." He shook his head. "Things got blown out of proportion." I listened without interrupting. He went on about the shop, about a disagreement with a supplier, about paperwork that had not been filed correctly. Then he mentioned his health vaguely, a scare nothing serious but enough to rattle him. Finally, he circled back to the wedding. That night, he said, sighing, I never should have said what I said. People took it the wrong way. There it was again, the deflection, the passive phrasing that removed agency. I did not respond. He leaned forward. "We are family, Sarah," he said. "Families move on. I am asking you to let it go, to put it behind us." I met his eyes and saw not remorse, but urgency. He needed something. "What do you need from me?" I asked. He hesitated, then spoke faster, as if speed might substitute for honesty. "I need you to talk to Daniel," he said. "Things have gotten complicated. His parents sit on a board with people I do business with. There have been questions. I just need someone to vouch that this was a misunderstanding, that I am not what people are saying." The request landed clean and heavy. He wanted my credibility to restore his standing without addressing the behavior that had damaged it. I felt no anger, only a deep, settled certainty. "I will not do that," I said. He blinked. "You do not even know what they are saying," he replied. "I do not need to," I said. He leaned back frustrated. "You are being unreasonable," he said. I admitted I made a mistake. "What more do you want?" An apology, he added quickly, as if pulling a lever. "I am sorry if you were hurt." The words were hollow even to him. I shook my head. "That is not an apology," I said. "And it does not matter." His eyebrows rose. "It does not matter," he repeated, incredulous. "You always do this," he continued. "When you get upset, you shut people out. This is just like you." The attempt to rewrite the narrative returned out of habit. I stopped him with a raised hand. "No," I said. "This is not about being upset. This is about boundaries." He scoffed. "Boundaries," he repeated as if tasting something foreign. "You read that somewhere." I did not smile. "I learned it the hard way," I said. "I will not be used to fix what you refuse to face." His jaw tightened. "So you are just going to let me deal with this alone?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He stared at the table, his fingers drumming lightly, then stopped. "You know I did a lot for you," he said quietly. I did not respond. He tried again. "Your mother would want us to be civil." I felt the familiar tug of obligation and met it with stillness. "My mother wanted peace," I said, "not pretense." He exhaled sharply and pushed his chair back. "Fine," he said. "I see how it is. You think you are better than us now." There was the old accusation polished and ready. I stood as well. "No," I said. "I think I am done paying for your comfort." He looked at me, then truly looked, and something in his expression shifted. Not understanding, but recognition that the leverage was gone. He stood slowly. "I was hoping you would help," he said. "I know I was not perfect, but I am asking." I held the door open. "I am protecting my peace," I said. "You should do the same." He stepped onto the porch and paused. "This is not how family works," he said without turning. "This is exactly how it works," I replied, "when respect is required." He left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, feeling the quiet settle around me. The decision did not feel dramatic, it felt final. I poured the water I had prepared back into the sink and washed the glass. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from my stepsister asking if we could talk sometime. I did not reply. Some conversations arrive too late to matter, others arrive right on time. Would you forgive or protect your peace? The consequences did not arrive all at once, and they did not announce themselves with drama. They came the way real consequences usually do, quietly, steadily, and without asking whether the timing felt fair. Over the weeks that followed Richard's visit, pieces of his life began to shift out of alignment. Contracts that had once renewed automatically stalled. Calls that had always been returned promptly went unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. None of it looked like punishment from the outside. It looked like gravity reasserting itself. People did not confront him openly. They simply adjusted their distance. Reputation does not collapse in public very often. It erodes in private conversations and subtle choices. I heard about it indirectly through my mother, who tried to keep her tone neutral but could not hide the strain. Richard was frustrated, she said, confused. He did not understand how one night could undo decades of work. I understood it perfectly. It had not been one night. It had been a pattern finally witnessed by people who mattered to him. The wedding had not created the truth. It had revealed it. My stepsister tried to intervene at first. She called once and left a voicemail that stayed vague, careful not to assign blame. I did not return it. Later, she sent a message asking if we could meet for coffee just to clear the air. I read it and set the phone down. Clearing the air implies shared responsibility, and I had learned not to carry what was not mine. From what I heard, she approached Daniel's parents privately, hoping to smooth things over to explain that Richard was misunderstood, that he had a rough sense of humor, that he meant well. They listened politely and thanked her and did nothing. Explanations do not land when the behavior has already been observed directly. The Foster family did not campaign against Richard. They did not need to. They simply stopped including him. Board positions shifted quietly. Recommendations went elsewhere. The circles he valued tightened without him at the center. He complained to anyone who would listen about how unfair it was, how people were too sensitive, how intentions no longer mattered. Fewer people listened each time. Intentions matter most when paired with accountability, and he offered none. Through all of it, I stayed where I was, doing the work in front of me, living a life that did not intersect with his unless I allowed it. That choice proved more powerful than any retaliation could have been. There was no satisfaction in watching his influence wane, but there was confirmation. The boundary I had drawn was not just personal, it had been instructive. Others took note. People who had once laughed uncomfortably now remembered the silence that followed Daniel's salute. Silence can be clarifying. It tells you where things end. My mother struggled the most, caught between loyalty and recognition. She called once asking if I might reconsider speaking to Richard just to help ease things at home. I told her gently that I loved her, but I would not change my decision. She did not argue. She sounded tired more than disappointed. I realized then that she too had lived under the weight of his certainty, and that my refusal had shifted something for her as well. Not freedom, perhaps, but possibility. At work, I noticed a difference in myself too. I slept better. I felt lighter. Not because I had won something, but because I had stopped carrying an invisible burden. There is a cost to constant self-editing, and I had paid it for years without noticing. Now that cost was gone. Occasionally, I heard rumors about Richard through acquaintances back home. A deal that fell through, a partner who withdrew, a social slight at a community event. None of it dramatic enough to justify confrontation, but together forming a pattern that could not be ignored. He grew more bitter, more vocal about how people had turned on him. He did not connect that bitterness to his own behavior. That was the final consequence. He was left alone with a story that no longer worked. My stepsister eventually stopped trying to fix things. She adapted as she always had, aligning herself with new narratives, distancing herself from the discomfort of accountability. We did not speak again. That absence felt clean. I did not miss the relationship we might have had because it had never truly existed. What surprised me most was how little energy it took to let the consequences unfold. I had expected guilt or second-guessing or a temptation to intervene. None came. I realized that refusing to rescue someone from the results of their choices is not cruelty. It is respect for reality. Richard had built his standing on the assumption that he could say what he wanted without cost. That assumption failed. The cost arrived not through me, but through the same social mechanisms that had once protected him. People who value reputation understand its fragility even if they do not admit it. I did not celebrate his losses. I did not recount them to friends. I did not mark them as victories. I let them exist as evidence. Evidence that words spoken casually can echo longer than intended. Evidence that dignity denied has a way of resurfacing in unexpected rooms. Months later, I received a short message from an old neighbor who had attended the wedding. "I saw what happened," she wrote. "You handled it with grace." That was all. It meant more to me than any apology Richard might have offered. Grace is often mistaken for passivity, but it requires restraint. It requires the confidence to let truth do its work without interference. Richard's position continued to diminish not because anyone targeted him, but because the foundation had cracked. People began to see him as risky, unpredictable, a liability rather than an asset. That is how social power fades, not with outrage, but with reassessment. Meanwhile, my life expanded quietly. I took on a new project, mentored another officer, accepted a posting that challenged me in new ways. The scar on my wrist remained unchanged, but its meaning felt settled at last. It was no longer something to explain or defend. It simply was. I did not need closure from Richard. Closure is a myth people cling to when they want permission to move on. I had already moved. The consequences belonged to him, and he carried them alone. That was not revenge. It was balance. I returned fully to Fort Campbell as summer edged toward fall, and the base settled into its familiar rhythms, the ones that steady you without asking how you are feeling. Mornings began early and predictably with the low hum of vehicles, the cadence of boots on pavement, the quiet competence of people who know where they are supposed to be. There was comfort in that order. After everything that had unfolded, I found myself grateful for days that asked only for attention and follow through. I resumed my routines without commentary briefings, reviews, mentorship, the small decisions that accumulate into trust. Nothing about my work changed outwardly, yet everything felt lighter inside. I no longer carried the need to anticipate harm in ordinary interactions. The vigilance that had once lived just under my skin began to ease. Peace does not arrive as an announcement. It arrives as permission to breathe without counting. Evenings grew quieter. I cooked simple meals, read before bed, walked the same path along the perimeter road, where the light slants low and gold near sunset. The scar on my wrist caught that light sometimes, and instead of pulling my sleeve down, I let it be. I noticed how rarely anyone here remarked on it, and how quickly my own mind stopped offering explanations that no one had asked for. The difference was subtle but profound. Shame recedes when it is no longer fed. I thought often about the distinction between privacy and hiding. For years, I had mistaken the latter for the former. Here, I practiced privacy honestly. I shared what mattered with people who had earned it and kept the rest without apology. The Army had given me structure long ago. Now, it offered space. I spent time with a small circle of friends who knew my history in pieces and respected the parts I kept to myself. We talked about work, about families, about the future in practical terms. There was no appetite for spectacle. That suited me. On weekends, I volunteered with a transition program helping soldiers prepare for civilian life resumes interviews, expectations. I recognized the tension in their questions, the uncertainty about who they would be without rank or routine. I did not give speeches. I listened and answered plainly. Identity, I told them, is something you carry, not something you display. That advice surprised me as it left my mouth. I realized I believed it now. The wedding receded further, becoming a reference point rather than a wound. When I thought of it, I did not feel the old surge of adrenaline. I felt alignment. The memory had found its proper place. Daniel sent a brief note once, no preamble, no praise, just a line thanking me for trusting him to do the right thing. I replied with equal brevity. Mutual respect does not require elaboration. I heard nothing more from my stepsister. My mother and I spoke occasionally, keeping our conversations focused on the present. She did not press me to reconcile. I sensed she was learning her own version of peace, one that did not depend on smoothing over every rough edge. We allowed the distance to exist without naming it. That, too, was healing. As the months passed, I noticed changes in my body that mirrored the internal shift. My shoulders rested lower, my jaw unclenched. Sleep came easier and stayed longer. These were not small things. They were evidence. Self-respect expresses itself physically when it is restored. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped preparing defenses for rooms I no longer entered. The energy that freed up found better uses. I took a challenging assignment, volunteered for a rotation that stretched my skills, mentored with more intention. Purpose deepened when it was no longer entangled with proving anything to anyone who refused to see. One afternoon, during a routine meeting, a junior officer asked about my scar with genuine curiosity, not entitlement. I answered simply and moved on. The room did not change. No one leaned in. No one recalibrated their opinion of me because it did not need recalibration. That moment mattered more than the spectacle ever could have. It was ordinary and respectful, and that ordinariness felt like a gift. Healing often looks like that, a return to normalcy without the old ache attached. I spent time outdoors when I could, running trails near the river, letting my thoughts drift. I found that memories surfaced differently now, without the sharp edges. I could recall Afghanistan without flinching, the wedding without bracing. Context had replaced distortion. The scar had returned to its rightful meaning, a record of service and survival, no more, no less. It did not require an audience. It required acknowledgement from the person who carried it, and that acknowledgement was complete. When the holidays approached, I made plans that suited me. I hosted a small dinner, invited friends who brought laughter and uncomplicated warmth. We ate well, talked easily, and left the evening without residue. I did not travel back to Dayton. I did not offer explanations. Peace had become a practice, and I protected it with the same discipline I applied to everything else. Looking back, I can see how the arc completed itself not with reconciliation, but with acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never change, and that change is not a prerequisite for your own healing. Acceptance that dignity does not need consensus. Acceptance that silence can be chosen rather than imposed. I had spent years withdrawing to survive. Now I chose stillness to live well. Fort Campbell remained what it had always been, a place of work and responsibility, but it also became a place of rest. I stood in my kitchen some evenings watching the light fade, thinking about how far I had come, not in rank or position, but in self-regard. The difference mattered. When you stop negotiating your worth, the world meets you differently. Not always kindly, but more honestly. And honesty is enough. I did not need a closing conversation or a final apology. The line had been drawn and honored. Healing did not require anyone else to participate. It required consistency from me. That consistency brought peace quietly, reliably, and without conditions. With distance came reflection, and reflection brought clarity that did not ask to be rushed. I began to see the shape of the story not as a sequence of confrontations, but as a lesson in alignment. Dignity, I realized, is not inherited. It is practiced. Blood can introduce you to people, but it does not entitle them to your inner life. For years, I had confused endurance with loyalty and silence with grace. I had believed that staying quiet kept the peace, when in fact it often kept the imbalance intact. Silence can be a shelter when chosen freely, but it becomes self-erasure when it is required for acceptance. The difference is not subtle once you see it. One preserves your center. The other trades it away piece by piece. I had spent too long confusing restraint with compliance because it had been safer that way. The wedding forced a reckoning not because of the insult itself, but because it revealed how quickly a familiar pattern could be exposed to daylight and corrected without cruelty. Justice arrived that night without shouting, without shaming, and without my participation beyond staying present. That mattered. I learned that justice is not the same as revenge, even though they are often mistaken for one another. Revenge seeks to flip the hierarchy. Justice seeks to dissolve it. Revenge centers the offender by making them the focus of pain. Justice recenters the truth and lets everyone adjust accordingly. I did not need to see Richard humiliated to feel whole. I needed the lie about me to lose its power. That happened the moment someone credible named the truth and stepped back. I did not gloat because gloating would have kept me tethered to his approval even in opposition. Detachment was the victory. I also learned that dignity does not require unanimity. Some people in that room never recalibrated. Some left holding on to their first impression because it was easier. That was fine. Dignity does not negotiate with convenience. It stands and waits. Those who are ready meet it. Those who are not move on. Over time, I became less interested in who understood and more interested in whether I was acting in alignment with my values. That shift changed everything. Blood ties complicate this lesson because they come with history obligation and the weight of shared memory. We are taught early that family deserves patience beyond reason and forgiveness without repair. That belief keeps many people trapped in cycles that reward harm and punish boundaries. I am not opposed to forgiveness. I am opposed to forgiveness that asks you to abandon yourself. Forgiveness without change is permission. Reconciliation without respect is theater. I chose something quieter. I chose to step away and let reality do its work. That choice was not an act of spite. It was an act of care for the person I had become. Silence after that became different. It was no longer a way to disappear. It was a way to listen to myself. There is a profound difference between holding your tongue to survive and holding it because nothing needs to be said. The first costs you something every time. The second restores you. I practiced the second deliberately. I stopped narrating my decisions for people who had already decided who I was. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped anticipating objections that never came from those who mattered. That restraint created space. In that space, I found peace, not because conflict had vanished, but because my participation in unnecessary conflict had ended. Justice as I experienced it was not cinematic. It was corrective. It did not punish. It clarified. It did not require apologies. It required acknowledgement. When that acknowledgement did not come from the person who caused harm, it arrived through the reordering of relationships. People chose differently once they saw clearly. That was enough. I do not believe in moral superiority. I believe in moral responsibility. Each of us is responsible for how we treat others when we have the advantage of an audience. Public words carry weight precisely because they shape narratives beyond the moment. That night reminded me how easily dignity can be undermined and how quietly it can be restored. It also reminded me that silence can be a weapon or a balm, depending on how it is used. I had used silence for years to absorb harm. That night, silence worked on my behalf because it was paired with truth spoken by someone who recognized it. There is no formula for that outcome. You cannot engineer witnesses or time revelations perfectly. You can only decide who you will be when the moment arrives. I chose steadiness. That choice continues to pay dividends. I think often about people who sit in rooms swallowing comments that shrink them, about those who are told they are too sensitive, too difficult, too much, about those who are advised to keep the peace when peace is defined as their quiet. If that is, you know this. You are not required to make yourself smaller to be tolerated. You are not obligated to educate people who have already dismissed you. You are allowed to set boundaries without justification and to leave when those boundaries are ignored. Dignity is not loud, but it is firm. It does not chase approval, and it does not bargain with contempt. It waits. Justice does not always arrive when we want it, and it does not always look the way stories promise. Sometimes it looks like a room going quiet. Sometimes it looks like a person losing influence without spectacle. Sometimes it looks like you sleeping better at night because you stopped carrying someone else's narrative. Those outcomes matter. They are not consolation prizes. They are evidence that alignment works. I do not regret the years I spent learning restraint. They taught me patience and discipline. I do regret the time I spent mistaking endurance for virtue. Virtue requires choice. Endurance alone is just survival. The reckoning came when survival was no longer enough. I chose to live with my values intact, even if that meant fewer relationships and less approval. The result was not isolation. It was clarity. Clarity about who belonged in my life and who did not. Clarity about what I owed and what I did not. Clarity about the difference between kindness and compliance. As I continue forward, I carry that clarity with me. It informs my leadership, my friendships, and the way I speak in rooms where power shifts quickly. I do not rush to correct. I do not rush to forgive. I do not rush to explain. I let behavior speak, and I respond to what is actually present. That approach has not made my life smaller. It has made it steadier. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it. 1 year later, the season turned again without ceremony, and the memory of the wedding had softened into something like a marker on a map rather than a wound. Time does that when you let it work without interference. I did not count the days, but I noticed the distance. What had once felt immediate now felt instructive. I was back in Ohio briefly that spring for a small community event, not a celebration exactly, and not an honor in the way people imagine honors. It was a recognition tucked into the agenda of a local gathering held at a modest civic hall near the river where folding chairs lined the walls and coffee was poured from large insulated containers. The purpose of the event was practical to acknowledge service and volunteer work connected to the area. Nothing glamorous, nothing staged. I attended because someone I respected asked me to come and because it felt right to show up without expectation. The room was small, familiar faces mixed with new ones, the kind of place where people nod first and ask questions later. When my name was mentioned, it was done simply without flourish. A few sentences about service, about consistency, about showing up when needed. I stood, accepted a small plaque, shook a hand, and returned to my seat. There was no applause that lingered, and no speech required. The acknowledgement was quiet, and that made it meaningful. Afterward, people approached one by one, not with curiosity, but with recognition. "Thank you," someone said. "We heard about what happened last year." Another added gently, "You handled yourself well." I nodded, thanked them, and changed the subject. I did not want the moment to reopen. I wanted it to settle. Across the room, I saw my mother standing near the back, speaking with someone I did not know. She caught my eye and smiled a real smile, not the careful one she had practiced for years. She did not cross the room immediately. She waited until there was space and then came to sit beside me. We talked about ordinary things, the drive, the weather, a neighbor who had moved away. When the event ended, we walked outside together and stood for a moment near the steps. She reached for my arm and squeezed once. "I am proud of you," she said quietly. There was no qualifier, no explanation, just the sentence. I thanked her, and that was enough. Richard did not attend. I knew that before I arrived. His absence was noted without comment, and that too was appropriate. Later, I heard he had been invited and declined, citing a conflict. Whether that was true did not matter. The distance between us had become stable and predictable. There was no animosity attached to it, just recognition of limits. On my way out, an older man stopped me near the door. He had been a friend of my father's years ago, and I remembered him from childhood gatherings. He nodded and said, "Your dad would have liked this." He said it plainly without sentiment. I nodded back. "I think so too," I replied. That felt honest. There was no need to extend the thought. Closure does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as alignment between past and present without forcing them into the same room. I left the hall and walked along the river path for a few minutes before getting in my car. The air was cool, the kind that carries the promise of summer without committing to it. I thought about how different my life felt now compared to a year earlier. Not louder, not bigger, just clearer. The scar on my wrist caught the light briefly, and I did not cover it. No one stared. No one commented. It was just there, a part of me like everything else. Later that evening, I received a short message from my stepsister. "I heard you were recognized today," she wrote. "Congratulations." I stared at the screen for a moment and then replied, "Thank you." That was all. We did not meet. We did not unpack the past. We did not pretend to be closer than we were. The exchange was polite, contained, and complete. That was the relationship now, and I accepted it without resentment. There was no full reconciliation with Richard, and there did not need to be. We existed in separate orbits that occasionally overlapped through shared history, but did not demand engagement. He did not apologize, and I did not wait for one. We had arrived at a quiet truce defined by distance and mutual avoidance. It was not ideal, but it was stable, and stability matters. Back at Fort Campbell, I returned to my routines with a sense of closure that did not require a final conversation. Closure is often misunderstood as a moment when everything is resolved and everyone agrees. In reality, it is the point at which you stop needing anything more from a situation. I had reached that point. The recognition I received that day did not rewrite my story, and it did not elevate me above anyone else. It simply placed my experience in the open without distortion. That was enough. I put the plaque on a shelf in my office beside a photo of my unit taken years earlier. Both items represented effort rather than performance, and that felt right. As the year continued, life unfolded in ordinary ways. Projects began and ended, people moved on, assignments changed. The wedding became a reference point I could mention without tension. Sometimes I spoke about it, sometimes I did not. It no longer defined me. The lack of full reconciliation did not feel like failure. It felt like honesty. Not every relationship can be repaired, and not every ending needs ceremony. Some things conclude quietly when the lesson has been learned and the boundary respected. I had learned mine, and I carried it forward without bitterness. That was closure enough. If you are a parent listening to this, I want to speak to you plainly and without accusation. Your words do not disappear when the room changes. They settle into memory and shape how your children hear themselves long after the moment has passed. Humor does not excuse harm, and familiarity does not grant permission. What you say in public carries extra weight because it teaches others how to treat the people you introduce. When you mock, you give the room consent. When you respect, you set a standard. Children do not forget which one you chose. If you are a step-parent, I ask you to consider the authority you hold even when you do not announce it. You enter a story already in progress, and every comment either steadies it or destabilizes it. Comparison is not guidance, and correction does not require humiliation. You can offer structure without erasing identity. You can lead without needing to win. The role is not about control. It is about care, and care is proven most clearly when you choose restraint in moments where you could dominate. If you are someone who has been mocked in public, I want you to hear this carefully. You do not owe the room an explanation. You do not owe anyone your history to justify your dignity. Silence is not weakness when it is chosen, and speech is not strength when it is forced. You get to decide which moments deserve your voice and which ones deserve your exit. The measure of your worth is not how quickly you respond, but how well you protect what matters to you. I did not tell my story to humiliate anyone. I told it to name a pattern that many people recognize but rarely articulate. That pattern says keep the peace even when peace requires your silence. It says be grateful for tolerance and call it love. It says endure and call it character. I believed that for a long time, and it cost me more than I realized. The turning point was not anger. It was clarity. Clarity that dignity is not negotiable and that respect is not earned by shrinking. It is sustained by consistency. Justice as I experienced it did not look like revenge. It looked like a truth spoken once and then allowed to stand. It looked like consequences unfolding without my involvement. It looked like choosing not to rescue someone from the results of their own behavior. That choice was not cold. It was clean. It allowed everyone involved to see the situation as it was, rather than as it had been framed for years. I want to be clear about something else. Boundaries are not punishments. They are information. They tell people what you will and will not participate in. They do not require agreement to be valid. When you set a boundary and someone reacts with anger or disbelief, that reaction is data. It tells you exactly how necessary the boundary was. You do not need to defend it. You need to honor it. There is a quiet confidence that comes from living in alignment with your values. It does not announce itself. It does not seek witnesses. It simply changes how you move through rooms and how rooms respond to you. I felt that change over time, not as applause, but as ease, as better sleep, as steadier breath, as fewer rehearsed conversations that never needed to happen. That is the reward of self-respect. It pays dividends that spectacle never can. If you are listening and thinking about a moment when you laughed along because it was easier than objecting, I am not here to judge you. I am here to invite reflection. Laughter in those moments is not neutral. It is a vote. Silence can be too. The good news is that awareness changes future choices. You do not have to relive the past to act differently next time. You only have to notice what feels wrong and decide not to carry it forward. If you are listening and thinking about someone you have hurt with words you cannot take back, it is not too late to change your behavior. Apologies matter, but only when they are paired with changed conduct. Saying sorry is not the end. It is the beginning of restraint. It is the choice to stop buying comfort at someone else's expense. I did not get a perfect ending, and I did not need one. Life rarely offers neat resolutions, and that is not a failure. It is an invitation to maturity. The story did not end with reconciliation. It ended with respect for limits. That respect created peace where chaos once lived. I share this not as a template, but as a reminder. You do not need permission to protect your dignity. You do not need consensus to walk away from harm. You do not need an audience to choose better for yourself. The most powerful changes often happen quietly when no one is watching and no one is applauding. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you for listening. Stories like this travel because they touch something personal and often unspoken. If this one reached you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it. Not to convince them of anything, but to remind them that they are not alone in navigating complicated families and public moments that test who they are. And before you go, I would like to ask you something simple. Tell me where you are listening from and whether dignity should ever be optional.